I found a phone lying in the street and thought it was nothing important, until it started receiving messages addressed to me. The strange part was that they knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. When I read the last message, I realized it wasn't a phone lost by accident, and that all of this was directly connected to my girlfriend. It was one of those Tuesdays that seemed specifically designed for nothing to go right. Daniel was walking down Rowan Street toward his apartment after an 8-hour shift at the distribution warehouse where he had worked for the past 3 years, his feet heavy inside soaked boots, headphones on playing something he was no longer really listening to, his mind drifting in that functional emptiness that settles in after a long day of physical labor. It was raining, though not heavily, just that thin, constant drizzle that never quite justifies pulling an umbrella out of your bag but still leaves you completely drenched after 15 minutes if you stop paying attention. He spotted it near the curb, almost touching the storm drain grate, seconds away from being dragged away by the stream of dirty water running along the edge of the sidewalk. It was a phone. Black, face down, with the plastic case slightly peeled away on one side as if it had fallen from a certain height or been thrown with some force. Daniel stopped and glanced around almost instinctively, as though there were an invisible camera judging him. The street was nearly empty at that hour. An elderly woman pushing a shopping cart was walking in the opposite direction about 20 meters away, but she was already turning the corner. No one else. He picked it up. It was a pretty expensive model, one of those phones that cost several paychecks, with the back glass intact but a thin crack in the lower left corner of the screen, like a tiny spiderweb trapped beneath the glass. He wiped it against the sleeve of his blue jacket and turned it over. The screen lit up on its own when it detected the light, almost as if it had been waiting for him. There was no password, no unlock pattern, no fingerprint request. That struck him as odd, though not odd enough for him to stop and think about it too deeply at the time. The clock read 7:47 p.m. There were no visible notifications in the status bar. No missed calls, no unread messages, no apps flashing alerts. The wallpaper was a photograph of a sunset over the ocean, one of those generic images that come pre-installed on almost every device or that anyone could choose without revealing anything about themselves. The home screen apps weren't arranged in any particular way. Overall, it looked like a phone nobody had ever finished setting up. Daniel considered leaving it exactly where he had found it. But the rain kept falling, the drain was barely a foot away, and something inside him, some badly directed sense of domestic responsibility, kept him from abandoning it there. He slipped it into the side pocket of his backpack with the vague intention of taking it to the neighborhood police station the next day, or posting a photo in the apartment building's residence group with some message like, "Found this on Rowan, does it belong to anyone?" Then he kept walking. At that moment, as far as he was concerned, the matter ended there, inside that pocket, on that meaningless Tuesday. He arrived at the building at 8:01 p.m. He took the stairs because the elevator had been broken for 2 weeks and the building superintendent kept promising it would be fixed this week. His apartment was on the 3rd floor. Apartment B. Laura wasn't home, which was perfectly normal for a Tuesday. She had graphic design classes at a studio across the city until 9:30, and usually got back around 10 after stopping somewhere to eat with her classmates. They had been together for 4 years, and that routine was as familiar and predictable as the way she always hung her keys on the second hook by the entrance instead of the first. Daniel kicked off his wet boots in the hallway, turned on the kitchen light, put a pot of water on to boil, and opened the refrigerator with the automatic motion of someone who still doesn't know what he wants to eat but feels compelled to look anyway. There was pasta, there was sauce, there were leftovers from the chicken Laura had cooked on Sunday. He chose the pasta because it was quickest. He slid the backpack off his shoulders and hung it over the kitchen chair. The found phone slipped gently from the side pocket and rested against the back of the chair with the screen facing upward. He was measuring salt when the phone screen lit up on the chair. It was a text message. No sound, no vibration. The screen simply illuminated in silence as if it had been waiting for that exact moment. An unknown number, no saved contact name, local area code. Daniel crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and picked it up. He read the message once, then again, then a third time, much more slowly, as if reading it differently could somehow change the meaning of those 4 words. The message said, "Hi, Daniel. You made it home. Good." Daniel stood frozen in front of the pot that had just begun to boil. His name. Someone had used his name, not a generic hello, not a sorry, I lost my phone, but his actual name, spelled correctly, directed at him with a precision that made it impossible to assume it was a mistake. And the statement that he had made it home, phrased in a way that suggested whoever sent it had been watching the clock and waiting for that exact moment. He turned off the stove. His appetite had completely disappeared. He picked up the phone carefully and examined it. Call history, empty. Message history, only that new text, nothing else. Gallery, 0 photos. Contacts, none saved. Installed apps, only the default system apps, nothing else, no social media, no configured email, no linked accounts. It was a blank phone. Completely blank. As if someone had factory reset it only hours earlier, or as if it had never been used for anything except that single message. That did not fit the profile of a phone accidentally lost on the street. At 8:31 p.m., while Daniel was still sitting at the kitchen table with uncooked pasta beside him and the water already cold, a second message arrived from the same number. "Have you checked Laura's nightstand drawer yet?" Daniel felt the floor shift beneath his feet, even though he knew perfectly well that absolutely nothing had moved. He walked to the bedroom. He opened the drawer of Laura's nightstand, the small drawer he had never opened before because he had always respected that space without anyone ever needing to ask him to. Inside, between a half-used sketchbook and a box of antihistamine pills, there was a sealed white envelope. No sender. His name written by hand across the center in handwriting he didn't immediately recognize. Just his name. Daniel. He didn't open it immediately. That would have been the kind of thing someone in a horror movie would do, or someone who had completely abandoned rational thought. Daniel was neither. He pulled the envelope from the drawer with 2 fingers, placed it in the center of the bed, and sat on the edge of the mattress staring at it for a length of time he couldn't calculate. It was possible the envelope had been there for weeks and he had simply never noticed it. It was possible Laura had hidden it there for some completely innocent reason, a memory, a personal note, something unrelated to the strange phone and the question it had just asked him. It was possible. But the phone knew it was there. The phone knew his name. And the phone knew he had arrived home at the exact moment he did. He called Laura. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. It was perfectly normal for her not to answer during class. The workshop was highly interactive and she always silenced her phone before going in. He knew that. And yet, that night, the normality of everything felt suspicious, as though every familiar thing around him had been subtly replaced by an almost perfect copy of itself, identical in every detail except one he still couldn't identify. He left a short voicemail. "Hey, it's me. Call me when you can, okay? Nothing urgent." The last part was obviously a lie, but he didn't know what else to say. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of white letter-sized paper, folded into thirds and covered on one side with small but perfectly legible handwriting, calm and deliberate, no smudges, no signs of haste, as if whoever had written it had done so carefully and with plenty of time. It began immediately, without greeting, without a date, without any heading to provide context. It read, "What you are about to read on this phone over the next few days will be difficult to process. Asking you not to react impulsively would probably be pointless, so instead of asking, I'm only going to explain why it matters that you don't. Before speaking to Laura, before doing anything at all, wait until you have the full picture. There are still pieces missing. Once you have all of them, you'll understand who is sending you these messages and why I'm doing this way instead of another. I'm not your enemy. I never was. What's happening is more complicated than it appears right now, and what it appears to be right now is already complicated enough." There was no signature. No date. No further indication of anything. Daniel read the letter 5 times. He studied the handwriting for several minutes, mentally comparing it to the writing of everyone he knew. It wasn't Laura's handwriting, which he would have recognized anywhere after 4 years of sticky notes on the fridge and grocery lists abandoned on the table. It wasn't the handwriting of any friend, any relative, anyone whose writing he could confidently identify. It belonged to a stranger, precise and deliberate. At 9:15 p.m., while Daniel was still sitting on the bed holding the letter, the 3rd message arrived on the found phone. "I know you already read the letter. Good. Now open the Notes app." The first thing he felt was anger. Clean, direct anger, without confusion or overlap, the anger of someone realizing he was being watched and that the observation was happening in real time, inside his own apartment, behind closed doors. Someone knew what room he was in, what he had opened, when he had finished reading. Daniel went to the bedroom window and looked outside. The street below was wet and empty beneath the yellow glow of the streetlights. In the buildings across from him, several windows were lit, but all of them were too far away to make out anything clearly, and none had a direct view into his bedroom from the angle where he stood. And yet, he opened the Notes app on the found phone. There was only one note. But it was long. Much longer than he expected. As he scrolled, Daniel saw it stretched across several screens, organized into sections, almost like a report. The first line, before any explanation, read, "His name is Marcus. He works as a senior designer at the same studio where Laura takes her workshop. They've been together for 7 months." Daniel had to read that first line 3 times before his brain processed it as factual information instead of a typo or misunderstanding. 7 months. He and Laura had been together for 4 years. 7 months was more than half the time she had been attending that studio. Most of her first year there. He kept reading. The note said Marcus was 28 years old, originally from another city, and had held that position for 3 years. That they had met in September of the previous year during an end-of-module exhibition where Marcus had been one of the guest evaluators. That the first time they went out alone was in October, under the excuse of reviewing Laura's portfolio for an application. That by November, the meetings no longer needed excuses. There were dates. Specific places. At the end of that first section there were attached images that Daniel opened, and they forced him to set the phone down on the bed and step out onto the balcony for 10 minutes because the cold air was the only thing that still felt breathable. When he came back inside, the note continued. The second section had a different tone. Less descriptive, more direct. It said the person writing all of this was not doing it to hurt him, but because they believed Daniel had an absolute right to know what was happening. That they had been watching him for weeks, him specifically, not just Laura, and that it was obvious he suspected nothing, that he lived inside the relationship with a kind of trust that, in the sender's words, was almost painful to watch. That this produced something very close to guilt in the person writing, even if technically it wasn't their responsibility. Then came a paragraph that made Daniel rise from the chair and remain standing in the center of the bedroom as if the floor itself had become unstable. It read, "What you still don't know is that Marcus is not simply someone Laura is having an affair with. Marcus Aldana is the direct nephew of Victor Salinas." Daniel knew that name. He knew it perfectly, every letter of it, the exact weight it carried each time it appeared in his mind. Victor Salinas was the man who had testified against his father 12 years earlier, giving testimony that had been decisive in the conviction. His father had already served 11 of those 12 years in a prison 400 kilometers away. The appeal had been dragging on for 2 years with a slowness that sometimes felt intentional. Coincidences of that scale did not exist. Daniel knew that. Coincidences of that scale were something else entirely. There was still a third section in the note, the shortest of all, and somehow the one that took him the longest to finish reading. It said, "What you still don't know is whether Laura understands any of this. Marcus knows exactly who you are. He pursued Laura deliberately because of you. What you need to understand before making any move is how much Laura knows. Whether she knew from the beginning, whether she is an active part of whatever Marcus is building, or whether she is, like you, someone being used without fully understanding it. That is the most important question. Answer it before you act. At exactly 10 p.m., with a precision that no longer surprised Daniel but still deeply unsettled him, the fourth message arrived. Laura gets home in 20 minutes. Before she arrives, check the inside pocket of her black jacket, the one she always hangs behind the bedroom door. Daniel went to the bedroom without thinking twice. Laura's black jacket hung exactly where she always left it, behind the door, suspended by the metal hook at the collar. It was a thick wool coat she wore during cold weather and had kept there since the previous winter. Daniel slipped his hand into the outer pocket empty. In the inside pocket, that narrow strip of fabric most jackets have and almost nobody uses, his fingers found something small and hard. It was a key. Not the key to their apartment, not the mailbox key, not any lock Daniel recognized. Smaller than those, the kind used for safety deposit boxes or filing cabinets, with a yellowed paper tag tied through the key ring hole using thin string. Daniel lifted the tag toward the bedside lamp. There was only one word written on it, and the handwriting belonged to his father. The word was evidence. Daniel read it 3 times. Then he looked at the key, then the tag, then the handwriting, and slowly sat down on the edge of the bed with the key clenched tightly in his fist as though someone might try to take it away from him. His father had been in prison for 11 years. He had never once mentioned any key, any evidence, any plan. But that was his handwriting. Absolutely impossible to mistake. Daniel placed the key on the nightstand and stared at it for a length of time he couldn't measure. The small bedside lamp illuminated it from an angle that made the metal shine in an almost ordinary way, as if it were the key to something trivial and not the most disturbing object he had held in his hands in the last 11 years. His father had written to him throughout all that time. Monthly letters, sometimes more frequently during the early years, letters about how he was doing, the routines of prison life, memories from when Daniel was a child, updates on the appeal that sometimes sounded hopeful and sometimes sounded like it was going nowhere. In none of those letters had he ever mentioned any Marcus. During none of Daniel's visits, which he made faithfully every month despite the 400 kilometers, had his father ever hinted at any plan involving Daniel's girlfriend, or any key, or any evidence hidden somewhere secret. They had talked about the appeal many times. About lawyers, deadlines, what could happen and what couldn't. But never about this. Either his father had deliberately hidden all of it from him to protect him from something, or someone else had access to his father's handwriting in a way Daniel still couldn't explain. He heard the key turning in the front door lock at 10:19 p.m., 2 minutes later than the phone had predicted. Laura walked in with her materials bag hanging from her right shoulder and her damp hair tied up in a loose, collapsing bun. She smiled when she saw him standing in the hallway, that familiar, genuine smile without any visible weight behind it. "Hey, I called you back but you didn't answer." She dropped the bag beside the entrance and leaned in automatically for the usual kiss on the cheek. "Did you eat?" "I haven't had anything all day. Is there any pasta left?" Daniel let her pass. He followed her into the kitchen. He watched her open the refrigerator with the absolute ease of someone who knew every inch of that space. Laura had always been, ever since he met her, a person with calm movements, no anxiety, no rush. That night, it became difficult for him to look directly at that calmness. "Laura," he said. Just her name. Stripped of any tone, no accusation yet, no question. She closed the refrigerator and looked at him. "What's wrong?" Daniel placed the found phone on the kitchen counter. He said nothing else. He just looked at her. Laura lowered her eyes to the phone for a second. Only a second. Then she looked back at him, and something in her expression changed in a way Daniel hadn't expected. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't the panic of someone caught. It looked far more like relief. Exhausted relief, the kind only people who have been carrying something alone for far too long can feel. "Where did you get that?" she asked quietly. "On the ground. Rowan Street. This afternoon, coming home from work." Laura leaned back against the counter and crossed her arms. Not defensively, more like she needed to physically hold herself together. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they were shining, not exactly with tears, but with that tension that exists right before crying, the kind some people can hold indefinitely. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice was steady. Steadier than Daniel would have expected. "And I need you to let me finish before you say anything, because if you interrupt me halfway through, I don't think I'll be able to start again." Daniel didn't respond. He waited. "Marcus Aldana is not what you think," Laura began. "I know what that note says, because I read it before you did. He showed it to me himself. I know how it looks. But how it looks isn't what it is." She paused briefly, organizing her thoughts. "Marcus approached me almost a year ago at the studio. He told me he knew you, that he knew who you were, that he had information about your father's case and needed a way to get it to you without exposing you too early. He told me he couldn't come directly to you because there were people watching him, and any direct contact between the two of you could alert people who weren't supposed to know yet. He asked me to act as an intermediary, to keep certain things hidden at certain times, to not tell you anything yet because the timing wasn't right." "And you believed him," Daniel said. "It wasn't a question. Not immediately. I asked him a lot of questions. I asked him to prove what he was saying was true. And he did, Daniel. He showed me documents, explained how he had uncovered everything, told me things about your father, about the trial, about Victor Salinas, things I couldn't verify on my own but that later, when I researched what I could, turned out to be completely accurate." "How long have you two been together?" Daniel asked. His voice sounded perfectly calm, which was probably the most unsettling thing of all. Laura looked directly at him. "We're not together. We never were. Not one day, not one night, nothing like that. What the note describes as a relationship is what Marcus needed it to look like from the outside to justify regular contact between us without attracting suspicion. Meetings at the studio, occasional messages. That part is real. The rest isn't. Daniel said nothing. He processed. The envelope in my drawer, he said after a moment. The letter. The key. Marcus gave me the key 3 weeks ago. He told me it was urgent, that he needed me to keep it somewhere safe, and that when the time came, you would know what to do with it. The tag already looked like that when he gave it to me. I didn't write it. He told me the handwriting belonged to your father, that they had managed to communicate. How? Through your lawyer. Andrea. Apparently Andrea has an indirect connection to someone Marcus trusts. They've been coordinating all of this for a long time. Months. Maybe longer. Daniel sat down in one of the kitchen chairs. The anger he had felt earlier had transformed into something harder to name, a mixture of disbelief and something dangerously close to hope, which was the riskiest emotion of all in situations like this, because hope, once shattered, hurts more than anything else. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. Laura sat down across from him. She took several seconds before answering. Because Marcus asked me not to. He told me that if you knew too early, you'd want to act immediately, and that acting before you had the full picture could destroy 11 years of work. He said the only way this could work was if you arrived at the truth on your own, at the right moment, with all the pieces already in your hands. She paused. And because I trusted him, I don't know if that was the right thing to do. That's something you're going to have to tell me. They looked at each other for a long moment without speaking. And who is Marcus, really? Daniel finally asked. Why would he do all of this? Laura rested her elbows on the table and clasped her hands together. Because Victor Salinas is his uncle. And because Marcus Aldana has spent the last 2 years trying to destroy him. Why? Daniel asked. A single word, but the most important one he had spoken all night. Laura looked at him for a second before answering. Because Victor destroyed something that belonged to Marcus too. Something Marcus can never get back. And the only way he found to get justice was to give your father back what was taken from him. Not out of altruism. Out of debt. They didn't sleep that night. They sat in the kitchen with the found phone between them while Laura filled in the missing parts of the story, the pieces Marcus had entrusted to her over months of conversation she had been forced to keep secret, carrying all of it alone without being able to tell the one person she had truly wanted to tell. Marcus Aldana had grown up in the Salinas household because his mother, Victor's sister, had died when he was 5 years old, and his father had disappeared even before that. Victor had raised him. Materially, he had treated him well, good schools, clothes, vacations, every kind of thing money could buy. In every other sense, Marcus had grown up in the shadow of a man who made decisions without explanations, who traded favors and collected debts inside a parallel economy of loyalties and obligations that Marcus, as a child, had observed without fully understanding and that Marcus, as an adult, had finally come to understand with brutal clarity. Victor Salinas was, in terminology he himself would never have used but which perfectly described what he did, a facilitator. He was not powerful in the traditional sense of the word, he had no personal fortune and no direct political influence, but he knew the right people and understood how to connect them. He knew who to call when someone needed testimony reshaped into something more convenient. He knew how to collect payment for that service without leaving any written trace behind. Daniel's father's case had been just one more entry on a list Marcus had spent years reconstructing. Daniel's father had been accused of accounting fraud he had never committed. Someone else had committed it and needed another man to carry the blame. Victor had arranged the testimony that buried him, testimony given by an accountant who, years later, vanished from the city with his debts erased and a brand new life somewhere else. Marcus had discovered it in the most mundane way imaginable, sorting through boxes of old documents stored in the attic of the Salinas house 2 years earlier during a move Victor had asked him to oversee because his back was no longer strong enough for the physical work. In one of those boxes, buried among papers Victor had clearly forgotten existed, Marcus had found an envelope filled with handwritten notes, transfer numbers, and a copy of the informal agreement between Victor and the accountant. The language was indirect, crowded with euphemisms, but the meaning was unmistakable to someone who had grown up listening to that language all his life. For 6 months Marcus had done nothing. He kept the documents, photographed them, and lived with the knowledge pressing down on him in a way that, according to what he later told Laura, didn't have a precise name. It wasn't exactly guilt because he personally had done nothing. It wasn't exactly anger because anger required energy and he felt too paralyzed for that. It was closer to the chronic nausea of discovering that the ground you've walked on your entire life has been built over something rotten. What finally pushed him to act was not heroism but something much smaller and far more human. Victor, with the terrifying confidence of men who haven't answered to anyone in years, casually told Marcus during a family dinner, over wine, that he was considering repeating the process with someone else. Another name. Another situation. The same mechanism. He spoke about it almost casually, almost as if he were talking about repainting the house. That night Marcus made his decision. It took him another year to build the case properly. Through an indirect connection involving one of Andrea's second cousins, who had studied with Marcus years earlier, he contacted Andrea, the lawyer handling Daniel's father's appeal. He sent her copies of the documents. Andrea reviewed them and confirmed they were enough to reopen the case, not as definitive proof on their own but as the foundation for a formal investigation capable of exposing what had been buried. But there was a problem: presenting the evidence too quickly, without a carefully constructed context, could give Victor enough time to destroy whatever remained and use his connections to neutralize the threat. They needed a way to reach Daniel that couldn't be intercepted or traced. They needed to make sure Daniel understood the entire picture before acting, and they needed to do it without Victor realizing that the nephew he had trusted for years was the source of the problem. That was why Laura became involved. That was why the key had been hidden in silence. That was why the phone had been left on the street. Daniel listened to all of it without interrupting, drinking cold coffee. Neither of them bothered reheating, watching Laura with the focused attention of someone simultaneously evaluating both the information he was receiving and the person delivering it. By the time she finished, the kitchen clock read 2:15 in the morning. "Do you believe him?" Daniel asked. "Yes," Laura answered without hesitation. "Not because I'm naive. Because what he showed me was real. And because nobody spends months building something like this for a lie." Daniel looked at the key resting on the table. The safety deposit box. It's in a bank branch. The branch number and the box number are engraved on the inside edge of the key, really small. You need direct light to see them. Daniel picked up the key and held it beneath the kitchen light. On the metal, in nearly microscopic lettering, were two numbers. A branch number and a box number. "When can I go?" "Tomorrow morning, as soon as they open." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street was completely still. "Laura," Daniel said, "when all of this is over, and if all of this is true, we're going to have to talk about what you hid from me." "I know," she said. "And I'm going to ask you to remember before the conversation happens that I did it because I was asked to, and because I believed it was the right way to help you. But I know that doesn't fix everything. And I know you have every right to be angry." Daniel nodded without saying anything else. That night was not the night for that conversation. The next morning, exactly when the bank branch opened, Daniel walked in with the key in his pocket and the box number memorized. The employee escorted him to the safety deposit room without asking any questions. Daniel inserted the key. The box opened. Inside was a thick manila folder secured tightly with an elastic band. Daniel removed it and opened it on the table inside the private room. It took him 2 hours to read everything inside. When he finished, he closed the folder, held it in both hands for a moment, and realized he was crying. Not exactly from sadness, but from that other kind of crying that appears when something broken for a very long time, far too long, finally has a real chance of being repaired. He called Andrea from his own phone. She answered on the second ring, as if she had been waiting for that call too. Andrea had been waiting for that call. Not specifically that morning, she hadn't known exactly when it would come, but she had been waiting ever since Marcus sent her the first copies of the documents more than a year earlier. The moment she heard Daniel's voice on the other end of the line, carrying the tone of someone who had just read something that changed everything, she knew the moment had finally arrived. They met that same afternoon at Andrea's office, a small, orderly space in a downtown office building, with shelves packed with folders and a window overlooking an interior courtyard where a tree had already lost all its leaves to autumn. Daniel arrived carrying the folder from the safety deposit box, and Andrea already had her own copies spread across the desk, the ones Marcus had sent months earlier, alongside the appeal documents and 3 years of accumulated work that now, suddenly, possessed the central missing piece it had lacked all along. They talked for 4 hours. Andrea was meticulous, as always. They reviewed every document in the folder, identified which ones were strong enough to stand on their own and which still required corroboration, mapped out the legal route the filing would need to follow to prevent it from being blocked before reaching the right hands. The accountant's testimony was the central knot, but it wasn't the only thread. The bank transfers documented in Victor's notes were verifiable. 2 additional names appeared throughout the documents, and Andrea believed both individuals might testify if given the proper context and adequate protection. "How long?" Daniel asked at one point that afternoon. "If everything works the way it should, and that's a very important if you need to keep in mind, we're looking at 3 to 5 months for the appeal ruling. Maybe less if the judge prioritizes the case after seeing what's in here. Maybe a little more if someone on the other side tries to slow it down." "And Victor?" Andrea folded her fingers together on the desk. "That's no longer part of the appeal itself. That's a separate process that can begin in parallel. It doesn't directly depend on us. But it does depend on getting these documents to the right people, which is exactly what we're going to do." Daniel nodded. 4 months. Maybe less. Maybe more. After 11 years, the difference between 4 months and 6 months was, relatively speaking, almost nothing. But in absolute terms, in the body, in the daily weight of knowing his father was still there, it was everything. That night he called his father. Calls from the prison were limited in length, 10 minutes maximum, and there was always something about the audio quality that made them feel farther away than they actually were. Over the years, Daniel had learned to use those 10 minutes efficiently, without detours, without wasting time on the kinds of conversational rituals that would have felt natural anywhere else. "Dad," Daniel said when his father answered. "I found the folder." A brief silence came from the other end. Then his father's voice, deeper than Daniel's, the voice of someone who always seemed to know exactly what he was going to say before saying it. "How did it get to you?" "By a long road. I'll explain the details later. But it got here." Another pause. "Did you speak to Andrea?" "Today. 4 hours. And?" Daniel searched for the right word. "She says it's enough." This time the silence lasted longer. And when his father spoke again, there was something in his voice Daniel had not heard in 11 years, something so rare he almost didn't recognize it at first. Relief. Real relief, not the forced optimism they performed during prison visits so neither of them would collapse, but the relief of someone who had spent 11 years carrying something unbearably heavy and could finally see a real possibility of setting it down. "And are you okay?" his father asked. "I'm okay," Daniel said. And this time, he wasn't lying. The months that followed were, in many ways, the strangest of Daniel's adult life. There was now machinery in motion that he had activated but no longer controlled directly, a sequence of legal and administrative processes Andrea handled with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for this moment almost as long as he had. Daniel attended meetings when summoned, signed what needed signing, answered the questions placed before him, and in the spaces between those moments tried to return to ordinary life carrying the strange sensation of someone awaiting the outcome of something enormous while still needing to continue living in the meantime. With Laura, he finally had the conversation they had postponed the night of the phone. It was long and difficult, the way important conversations are supposed to be, and by the end of it Daniel understood that Laura had made decisions based on the information she had and under the restrictions Marcus had placed on her, and that those decisions had not been perfect but they had been honest. That didn't fix everything immediately, but it was a real starting point. Marcus never contacted Daniel directly. Laura explained that Marcus preferred to stay out of sight once the process was underway, that there were practical reasons related to his own safety while the parallel case against Victor continued moving forward. Daniel accepted that without pressing for more. He considered it a debt so enormous that there was no conventional way to repay it, and respecting the distance Marcus needed was, for the moment, the only way to honor it. 4 months and 17 days after the afternoon of the phone on Rowan Street, in a small, cold courtroom with cream-colored walls and a ceiling fan turning lazily overhead despite the lack of heat, the judge read the appeal decision. Daniel's father sat 3 meters away on the defendant's bench, though it was no longer truly the bench of a defendant, but the bench of someone the system was finally about to recognize for what he had always been. He wore the navy blue suit Daniel had brought him the week before in a garment bag, the same suit his father had preserved for 11 years with a conviction Daniel had always considered excessive, almost irrational, until he finally understood that keeping the suit had been his father's way of refusing to accept that his situation was permanent. It wasn't. When the judge finished reading the ruling and the opposing attorney made no motion to contest it, Daniel looked at his father. His father's eyes were closed, his head tilted slightly forward, his hands resting on his knees. He stayed that way for 3 or 4 seconds. Then he opened his eyes and looked at Daniel. And in that look there was something Daniel had no exact words for, something beyond joy and sadness and every emotion that exists by itself, something that can only exist in the face of a person who has finally closed something that remained open far too long. That night they ate dinner together in the apartment on Rowan Street, the 3 of them, Daniel, his father, and Laura. His father didn't speak much during dinner. He ate slowly, observed the apartment with the particular attention of someone rediscovering civilian spaces after years away from them, and at one point, without any special context, casually remarked that the coffee smelled good. Nothing more. Daniel considered that enough. After dinner, while Laura washed dishes and his father drifted half asleep on the living room couch with the television murmuring softly in the background, Daniel emptied the backpack he had brought home from the bank months earlier and never completely unpacked. At the bottom of the side pocket, forgotten between an old receipt and a pair of worn-out headphones, he found the phone. He turned it on. The battery was at 4%. Enough. There was one final message, sent that morning at 9:12, just as Daniel must have been arriving at the courthouse. It read, "When you read this, it'll already be over. Thanks for not throwing the phone into the drain." Daniel smiled. It was the first time in many months he had smiled that way, with nothing underneath it, without the weight of what was still coming or what remained unresolved. Just the smile. He typed a reply, "Thank you too. For everything." He sent the message. The delivery indicator never appeared. 30 seconds later, the phone displayed an error message, the destination number did not exist. The screen flickered once and shut off permanently as the battery reached 0. Daniel placed it on the table. Then he walked into the living room, sat down beside his father, and for a while the two of them watched television in silence, without speaking, without needing to, wrapped in the kind of stillness that only exists between people who have survived something enormous together and know that the important words have either already been spoken or can wait until tomorrow because, for the first time in a very long while, tomorrow no longer contains anything urgent waiting for them. Outside, Rowan Street was dry. It wasn't raining.